and I'm really actually excited to hear from our next presenters. I'd like to introduce Kristen Van Hook and Anissa Rodriguez of the National Institute for Teaching Excellence in Teaching. Kristen is a Senior Vice President of Public Policy and Development, and Anissa is a Senior Program Specialist, and I have previewed their slides, and I know they have a lot of really terrific information to share. So I know it's the end of the day, but please be thinking of your questions as they're speaking. If you have burning questions, you can add them to the chat unless they invite you to ask your questions during the presentation. So with that, I'm just going to hand it over to Kristen and Anissa. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
You sound good.
Okay. I'm going to start out, and then I'm going to hand it off to Anissa just to give you a little bit of a sense of how this is going to flow. I'm going to talk a little bit about our design suggestions and some of our experience kind of leading to both the design and the implementation of our system. And then Anissa is going to talk in much more detail about our work in Tennessee. Again, we encourage you to interrupt us with questions during the presentation. So we're with the National Institute for Excellence in Teaching. Some of you may be familiar with NIET from our work over the last 12 years with the Teacher Advancement System. We initially called it TAP, the Teacher Advancement Program, and then of course people were noting that it really is not a program, it's a system, and so we changed the name. And TAP is an initiative that is in a number of states, about 13 states in the coming school year, 500 schools, and impacting a number of teachers and students, about 200,000 students next year. And the reason I just start with this is to give you a little bit of a sense of why we come at these issues the way we do and what our experience is based on. For many years, we implemented TAP as a comprehensive reform. I'm going to take just a slide after this to describe what it entails. But after many years of doing that, we're firm believers in the importance of a comprehensive approach to teacher effectiveness. But at the same time, things were moving in so many different areas that we felt a real need to be supportive and helpful where we could on the evaluation issue in particular. And so we created what we call our NIET Best Practices Center, and that's where the work is being done with the state of Tennessee. And what we're doing there is working with folks on some of the lessons we've learned in various aspects of teacher effectiveness. So even if they're not prepared to do a full comprehensive approach such as TAP, that there's a lot we can contribute to their efforts to build, for example, better evaluation systems. We put out a report. I put it up here because it's something you may want to take a look at. We have a couple of other reports on evaluation on our website, but this report, More Than Measurement, includes what we pulled out, essentially 10 lessons learned for designing better teacher evaluation based on our experience in these TAP schools. I'm not going to walk through all the 10 lessons, but you're free to go take a look at that. I'm going to highlight a few of them. I think one of the things that's important to emphasize is we really do believe that effective evaluation is part of a larger system. And so the professional support, for example, we think is critically important. We also have worked in TAP on performance-based compensation, both in terms of differentiated staffing. So we have here this multiple career paths. We have additional compensation for master and mentor teachers who in TAP schools form a part of a leadership team that conducts evaluations. So I just give that to you because I think it is an important context setter for some of the perspectives we bring. Let me just see if anyone has any questions before I continue. So one thing I wanted to emphasize is that the TAP evaluation was specifically designed to do two things: to accurately measure performance and to support improvement. And those two goals really drove the design of the system. Everything from, the number of levels on the scale of the instructional rubric, a lot of decisions around that. There were just a lot, the use of peer evaluators. Many of the decisions that we made in the structure of the system were based on the fact that we really had those two goals in mind, not only accurately measuring performance, but also supporting improvement. And I think as Tim highlighted, and I was nodding my head as he was saying this, it's such a massive culture change to go from a system where everybody has been told that they're operating at the highest level to one where people are given information that doesn't follow that pattern. And so I think I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've dealt with that in TAP schools, because I do believe that's such an important thing that we just keep coming back to, and we're coming back to it again in Tennessee. So here I'm just on this slide on the classroom observation component. I think this is very familiar to everybody, but I just wanted to emphasize the idea of multiple evaluations is an essential point here, because then this also illustrates how important it is that this is about improvement over the course of the year, not just a judgment at the end of the year, gee, what are you doing at the end of the year, but at least we recommend at least 4 evaluations over the course of the year so people can track their improvement. By multiple trained and certified evaluators. We're going to talk more about that. We also emphasize quite heavily the concept of the post-conference. And again, that's a part of a structure where we're making sure this information is used for improvement, and that teachers are given very specific, actionable information to help them to improve. And again, where Tim had referenced that there's a lot of teaching going on that I think many people would think is a little lower than they would have expected. Teachers need very specific guidance, we believe, in order to improve those skills. We talk a lot about guiding people through kind of deliberate practice, where they'll take a specific skill and work on that specific skill in anticipation of their next evaluation. And Anissa will probably speak a little bit more about this, but it goes to the structure of our post-conferences, where we choose one area of strength to emphasize and one area of weakness. We call that the area for refinement. The area of strength is the area of reinforcement. And that is very deliberate in the sense that we are really trying to help people improve on skills, as opposed to just giving them a score across a whole range of skills that it's very difficult for them to then figure out what they want to do with that information. And then I mentioned here we mentioned in this slide the follow-up support. So in a TAP school, we have follow-up through weekly professional development that's school-based. We believe strongly in the power of building capacity within that school and building expertise within that school to provide those resources, to provide that professional development, as well as through individual coaching. And we're also going to describe to you in greater detail what we've been doing in terms of online resources, which we're finding is a huge benefit, especially to teachers who didn't always have access to that in the past. So just quickly here on this slide, I don't want to belabor this too much because Tim talked about the widget effect, but we show this slide to people, and you'd be amazed how many people say, well, we don't want our teachers to be on the right-hand slide. We want the left-hand slide. We want all of our teachers to be great. I mean, you'd be shocked how many people say that when you show them these charts, and then you proceed to have the conversation about the fact that the chart on the left really does not accurately reflect true skills in those districts if you look at other measures of performance. And so I think we cannot underestimate the difficulty of this conversation and how important it is that accurate measurement has to happen before anything else can happen. Because if people are still believing that they're operating at the highest possible level, all these other efforts to support improvement are going to kind of fall on deaf ears. Essentially, they already think that they're operating at the highest level, so what do they need to change? And I would just note here, too, that the scale on the right is our classroom observation scores in TAP schools. This is before you take into account value-added. Value-added student achievement learning growth follows a similar curve. And we find that extremely important in TAP schools, because part of changing this conversation is changing it from, we're not talking about you as an individual or your level of commitment. We're talking about your ability to impact student achievement. And it becomes a less personal conversation in some ways, in the sense that we try to talk about the lesson as opposed to the person, the teacher themselves. And I think we found that it's extremely important. It really helps that conversation if the classroom observations bear some relationship to the student achievement learning growth scores. Then teachers can start to see those connections and understand why we're looking for a much more differentiated range of performance in terms of the classroom observation. They understand the reasons why then much better. So I have here this slide just talking a little bit about how on our classroom observations we have a scale from 1 to 5, 3 being proficient teaching, 4 being above average teaching, and 5 being exemplary, and then similarly on the other end, 1 being unsatisfactory and 2 being below average. One of the things that's come up a lot with states that are looking at 4-level systems is we find there's some benefit here in the classroom observation, even if you have a 4-level system for your summative score of teacher performance. if your classroom observation has 5 levels or has some middle level, whether it's 3 levels or 5 levels, then I think you're able to show people the connection between. There are going to be a lot of people who basically get a solid year's growth with their students. And those people on our observations, our classroom observations, are basically proficient teachers, but they are not above or below average. And again, we can talk more about this as we go through the presentation, but we're finding that that's a really important connection for teachers to make. Oops, I might have skipped a slide. And here I just put up a slide briefly on our multiple measures. Of course, they're not exactly the same. You're measuring different things with the classroom observation and the student achievement, but we've found over time that teachers in TAP schools who score higher on the classroom observation tend to have students who score higher on value added, reinforcing that message. The TAP teaching standards, I'll go quickly through this, I think you're all familiar with this, are based on research and also based on our 12 years of practice in terms of looking at results in schools. We can talk more about this if people have questions. I'm just looking at the time. I want to hand this over to Anissa. And then here I've got the instructional domains. I think you can probably read that. It's a little bit small. Much more of this is available if you have more questions. You'll see the asterisks are on those items that are covered in a classroom observation. And generally we recommend an hour-long observation. We recommend 4 to 6 a year. But we have, in Tennessee, for example, we've worked with the state as they've made changes to that to accommodate their ability to have multiple observations, but not to have quite that many. And Anissa is going to talk about that in greater detail. And then just lastly here, I thought I would show one indicator. This is one of the indicators in the instructional rubric, this one, academic feedback. And so you see, and I bring this up because there is a lot of conversation about how specific or how general to be. And you'll see here that proficient in the center is a 3 on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 is unsatisfactory, of course, and then 5 would be exemplary. And part of what's going on here that's so important, and I think this was also echoed in the first presentation by TeachScape, is the importance of giving teachers really specific information about what you're talking about. Evaluations in the past tended to be so vague, and people were given very vague feedback. Here we try to give people as much very specific feedback as we can, and they use this as a guide for thinking about their own practice and ways that they could improve. They also use our video library and our training modules and other resources to go and look at, well, what does proficient look like on this particular skill? What does exemplary look like? And to get some ideas of what that practice looks like and what those teachers are doing well. Also in a TAP school, we encourage teachers to see each other's classrooms and in order to see, what teaching looks like at various levels. The other thing I wanted to emphasize here is just in terms of the specificity, we tried during the post-conference to provide evaluators in the TAP teaching standards provide a lot of very specific feedback on how teachers could improve those skills, and they focus on one in particular usually that's a strength and one that's a weakness, as I had mentioned. And this range of 1 to 5 gives a pretty good ability to differentiate, and we would argue that it's a good balance or a balance between being specific enough for people to have information to take action on, but not being so broad that or give them so many different things to look at that they're overwhelmed. And that is a challenging balance to strike, I think, when you're looking at what's covered in an evaluation. So let me let Anissa take it from here.
Thanks, Kristen. So we're going to dig into a little bit more detail about this concept of Interrater reliability. And what we would define that as is having consistent scoring amongst the evaluators that are in a team engaging in this observation process in a school and really digging into the evidence, discussing what they've observed, discussing the evidence that has been collected, and then assigning scores within at least 1 point of each other based on the rubric that they're utilizing for that evaluation. Something that we've been talking about a lot and learning through our 12 years of experience and training with our observers is that it's not enough just to have a system in place for monitoring Interrater reliability, but there has to be a follow-up and a support in order to improve that process and to have those crucial conversations as an evaluation team or as a leadership team surrounding the whole evaluation process, and then engaging and making time to have activities as a group that will ensure that everyone has a collective understanding of the rubric, of the way that they're collecting evidence and the evaluation process overall. So we'll talk about the system that we use to collect that in just a little bit. So other things that we've learned through our training and our years of experience in training evaluators, initially you have to ensure that everyone on the evaluation team understands the rubric and that they have engaged in looking at videos themselves, that they've talked about collecting evidence and assigning a score with other members of their evaluation team, that they actually are aware of what that would look like in the classroom. During the training, a lot of what we do is that we actually model how to categorize evidence and assign scores, and then we allow the participants to work in groups to capture evidence after we watched lesson videos from our video library. Then they practice coming to consensus on scoring, and then they practice independently with the support of the trainer, collecting evidence, discussing it, making sure that it's aligned to the rubric, and that they're scoring accurately, given our national rater scores. We also train, as Kristen said, on the pre-conference process, and that occurs before the lesson observation to give the evaluator the context of the lesson that they're going to observe. And then we train on the post-conference process, which is the reflective conversation that occurs as a result of the observation. So then, in order to understand that measure, the next step would be having the evaluators actually apply the rubric in that controlled environment. So at the beginning of the year, all of our evaluators take a certification test online, and it includes two different sections. The first section is watching an actual lesson video and then scoring it and making sure that their range of scores falls within at least 1 point of the national raters. And then there's a section about the post-conference process. So they either watch video clips of different post-conferences that we've gathered in our video library, or they answer questions about that process in order to demonstrate that they would be able to effectively lead a post-conference in their school or to plan a post-conference. After they've gone through and passed that certification test, then there has to be that ongoing support to apply it successfully. So this is where we encourage our evaluation teams to go in and look at our code system online. This is a comprehensive online data entry system where they go in, they enter in their observation scores as a result of the evaluation, and they can produce 28 different reports that they can share with their evaluation team to look at Interrater reliability, to see how closely the evaluation team is scoring to one another. They can look at school-wide areas of growth, school-wide areas of need, and then they can tailor professional development to those needs. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple of slides. So two of the ways that we encourage our teams to monitor Interrater reliability, we have the online data system on the left, which is the code system. And then we also have our NIET Best Practices Center portal. And this has a plethora of resources for our evaluators and for our teachers to use to practice looking at lesson videos, seeing what a 3 looks like, what a 4 looks like on the rubric, what a 5 looks like in a particular indicator, looking at modules that really focus in on that particular indicator, and trying to improve themselves in whatever area they've identified for their area of refinement, which is their area of improvement. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of some reports that can be generated from this code system that we have, this comprehensive online data system. This would be an example of a report that shows inconsistent scoring across evaluators. So if you have two master teachers, Master Teacher A, Master Teacher B, it seems in this example that Master Teacher A is scoring much higher than Master Teacher B. So we see that when there's inconsistency in scoring like that that needs to be remedied, we would encourage our evaluation team to get together, not to generate the report, but to practice somehow together in a team going in and observing a live lesson, if a teacher was willing to volunteer to do that, or to go and look at videos on the library and then calibrate their scoring to get more closely calibrated amongst the evaluators. And that would help to at least reduce the amount of score inflation that was occurring in the school. And you could look at this from not just the master teachers, but the administrators. The career teachers can even go into the code system and look at their own evaluation scores so that they can track what progress they're making over time throughout the school year. This is another kind of report that we could generate in code. This would be an example of inconsistent scoring of one particular indicator. So if this was the case that we saw in a school after looking through the code data, then we would encourage a leadership team to examine their collective understanding of that indicator, and then perhaps go to the portal, watch a module on questioning in particular, because this one looks like there's a lot of discrepancy amongst the evaluators. They could look at lesson videos, they could look at samples of trainings that have been created by people from NIET or people from the state level that would target just that indicator, or even watch a live lesson again to agree upon a collective understanding of that indicator and to ensure that they're viewing the rubric accurately and they're scoring accurately as an evaluation team. This would be an example of an average observer score against the teacher's self-score. So another item that we have in our evaluation process is the ability of the teacher to self-evaluate. So after an observation is completed, the observer gets a copy of the teacher's self-evaluation scores, so they're able to see what the teacher's perception is of their own lesson that was just evaluated, and that'll help them to better prepare to engage in that reflective conversation that happens in the post-conference process. They can compare the teacher's self-scores with their own actual scores that they've collected after they go in and observe the lesson, and then they can see how close or far apart those scores are. So if we look at this example, we would see there are a couple of differences of 2 points or more. Lesson structure and pacing happens to be one of those areas. The observer average for that is a 2, and the teacher has scored themselves a 4 in that area, so significantly higher. So a discussion would definitely had to be made about that. And they could talk about, what does that look like in the classroom? What are some things that you understand that that indicator includes? They could look at the descriptors and make sure that they have an accurate understanding of that indicator. This would be an example of looking at overall averages by indicator school-wide. And this is a great tool that they could generate in code to look at targeting school-wide areas of need. So if we look at this, for example, thinking is one of the lower scoring areas. Maybe that would be a school-wide area for professional development that could be targeted either in cluster meetings or in a faculty meeting, or sometime apart from the school day, they could schedule a professional development that would target school-wide improvement in that area, since that's one of the lower scoring areas. So some ways to help build Interrater reliability at the front end. Since all of our evaluators are trained as a team, they kind of bond during that training experience. They've gone through it together. They've gone from having no experience or no exposure to the rubric to having a common language, a common understanding. We really encourage them to be trained together at the front end and as much as they can be. And then they have to pass that certification test that we talked about earlier, as well as being recertified annually. So not only do they have to certify at the front end initially, but every year they have to recertify to show that they still have an accurate understanding of the rubric. And that includes coming within 1 point of the national rater scores on the video that they score on their certification test. And then their initial training is supported through all of the resources they find on our best practices portal. Other ways they can address Interrater reliability over time, they can use the code system as we've been talking about. We encourage our evaluation teams to go in and ensure that everyone on the evaluation team, when they look at their averages of the observers in the school, is scoring within at least 1 point of each other. And this is a great way to see which evaluators are scoring much higher than others or much lower than others, or where they would need to calibrate as a team. We always recommend to our new evaluation teams that at least once a month they practice some kind of activity to ensure Interrater reliability. And that could include going into classrooms and watching even a 15-minute snippet of a lesson and then coming back and having a detailed conversation about what they observed, how it aligns to the rubric, how they can score it, or how they would score it, and then comparing it to each other and having a conversation to ensure that their collective understanding remains consistent. Skips ahead a little bit. So we're going to look at, in just a moment, we're going to show some different screenshots from our portal that we keep mentioning. But really, just to summarize the whole discussion about Interrater reliability, this is a continuous improvement process. So once our teams are trained, then there's a continual process of improvement that occurs. There's support that happens in the classroom. There's a discussion that's had as a leadership team. Then they come back to the post-conference that happens as a result of the observation, and then the cycle starts all over again. So there has to be initial training. There has to be support, not just having a system in place to monitor that Interrater reliability, but really ensuring that there is support, there's follow-up, there are activities for teachers to feel validated in this process, and like they can actually trust the process. It's a very important point that we try to emphasize in our trainings.
Anissa, this is Corinne. Can you go back to that slide for a moment?
Sure.
It seemed like a good place to connect with something Tim Daly said at the end of his presentation. He was really making a case for the folks who supervise principals, the level above the building principal, as key players in helping to keep principals on track and that have the most leverage with principals. And it seems like that person might fit in with a leadership team. So I wondered if you could say a little bit more about what you do with that level of supervision, the folks who are kind of supervising the observers, and what kind of supports they offer principals and what kind of roles they play, or what kind of tools you give them to encourage folks to be on target or in the strike zone, as Tim was saying.
So in the TAP system, when we train our new evaluators, depending on the site and depending on what their wants or needs are, we often do encourage them to bring people from their central office to the training because they want to be exposed to this new evaluation process and this new comprehensive score form model. So we encourage them to come, and often we have a lot of people from the central office attend our training just as if they were going to be observing in a school. And they can listen to the conversations that leadership team is having. They can even request to have access to the data in the code system so they can ensure that, let's say I'm a central office administrator and I have 6 schools in a district that are implementing this particular evaluation system. I could go online and view the consistency of the evaluators in a particular school and even compare one school to another. If the district agrees that they should have that level of access, then we kind of tailor the level of access to the request that we get at the local education agency. So every site is a little bit different in what levels of access they request and how involved the district personnel are, depending on how big or small the district is. In Tennessee, we often had a lot of district personnel who not only were attending the training to learn more about the rubric, but some of the districts were so small that people from the central office actually were evaluators in the schools because maybe the school only had one principal or a principal and an assistant principal, and they didn't have any other instructional leadership positions who would be appropriate to have as an evaluator. So some of the central office personnel were trained, they were certified, they took a certification test, and they attended the training just as they would if they were a regular evaluator.
So it sounds like lots of districts or states are choosing to train that level of staff, and then what the role is for them as far as monitoring may vary depending on the place.
Right, depending on what their level of involvement is. Yeah, it does vary from one place to another, but we welcome them to come to the training, and oftentimes they think it's really interesting to listen to those conversations for people they're working with, you know, master teachers, mentor teachers, principals, and assistant principals. They find it really interesting to work at that level with them and see what their conversations sound like surrounding teacher effectiveness and evaluation.
This is Kristen. Just one quick thing to add. I mean, one of the superintendents in Tennessee wrote an op-ed after going through the certification process himself, and that actually we thought was a really powerful piece because, you know, obviously kind of making the, you know, in a funny way, kind of making the points about the challenges, but how much he got out of it and showing that he was, you know, fully committed to this process and also experiencing it directly in some way.
Thanks.
No problem. I'm going to talk just very briefly about Tennessee and then show some screenshots of the portal that we've been mentioning during our presentation. So one of the first projects that our Best Practice Center took over was a collaboration with the state of Tennessee in which we trained 5,000 evaluators in more than 100 4-day sessions this past summer. because Tennessee selected our evaluation rubric as their statewide tool for teacher evaluation. So there were a couple of field tests that were conducted at the beginning. There were 3 different rubrics that the state of Tennessee was looking at, and then they finally selected the TAP teaching standards as their classroom observation for their statewide model. So as I said, we supported and trained 5,000 evaluators in 100 different trainings. And this is a list of the location and the number of trainings that we conducted. We have a map to show you visually where the districts were located in Tennessee. These are all the districts in the state of Tennessee that are currently implementing our evaluation tool. This is a suggested observation cycle that was given to the individuals who attended our training by the state. So through this guidance from the state, they separated out the sequence of observations by professional teachers and then apprentice teachers. So professional teachers would have 4 observations. Some of them are formal, some of them are informal. And then the same with the apprentice teachers. They have formal and informal observations depending on the type. So they're not only over the instructional rubric, but they're also over the planning rubric, which is about lesson plans, and then the environment rubric, which is more about classroom management. And then depending on the type of observation, they have either a formal or informal pre-conference, and then a formal or an informal post-conference. And schools could certainly deviate from this guidance that was given by the state, but it was given just as a suggested initial sequence of observations. So now we'll look at a couple of screenshots of our online portal, which has been a tremendous resource for our schools, especially in Tennessee. Currently, we have 90,000 users in our system. We've had 10,000 people go online and take our certification test and pass our certification test. And it's essentially a warehouse of resources that teachers, evaluators, administrators, even district personnel can have access to help guide them in this evaluation process. The first tab, they have all the evaluation resources they would need. They have templates, they have copies of the rubric, copies of the handbook, and materials that they received in our training. In this next section, this is where they actually go in and take the certification test online, and includes those 2 parts, watching an actual lesson video, gathering evidence, evaluating that lesson, and then answering questions about the post-conference process, or watching snippets of video, and then evaluating how effective those post-conferences were. And it gives them immediate feedback as to whether or not they passed, and they can even print out a certificate of completion if they passed the test. In our video library, we have over 120 hours of video that we've collected, and all of our lessons are shot split screen. So you can hear not only what the teacher is saying, but also what the students are saying, because they have little microphones taped to their desks that we tell them not to mess with when they were doing the filming. But you can hear what the kids are saying, which we think is really valuable when observing as well. But not only do we have classroom lessons, but we have accompanying pre- and post-conferences, as well as the documents that our national raters have collected with evidence and scores and feedback, so they can improve their performance on each of the 19 indicators just by watching a certain video. They can go in and search by objective of the lesson. They can look at subject area, grade level. They can sort by any criteria that they want. And we have videos from pre-K all the way through 12th grade. These are our training modules. These are essentially mini professional development sessions that are aimed at helping teachers to improve in one particular indicator from either the instructional rubric or the designing rubric or the environment rubric. They provide research, tangible examples of activities or materials for that lesson or for that indicator. They can look at video clips or samples of videos that are high examples, low examples. We can look at the evidence to actually see, for a particular descriptor, what does it look like in the classroom? How can I replicate something like that in my own lessons? And we're tiering them currently by difficulty, so we have more basic explanations for novice users, more complex trainings for advanced users. This is the access port of our data system, which is called Code, and this is our evaluation warehouse, so to speak, where our evaluators go in, they collect their data, they enter it in, and it's housed here. And it can be used, like I said, by evaluators at all levels. Even career teachers can go in and track their own evaluation data, and then they can generate reports like the ones that we looked at earlier, so they can see how close they are in scoring to one another, this Interrater reliability. Here are some more screenshots of those reports that we looked at earlier. Another really important point about the project in Tennessee was that after we trained the 5,000 evaluators, we didn't just leave them at that point, but the state actually required each of the administrators that we trained to go back to their schools and provide either a half day or a whole day training in the evaluation process. So we provided a lot of the evaluation materials for them on our portal. We provided a PowerPoint for them, either a half day or a whole day. They had a training manual that had a screenshot of every slide that was included in the presentation, along with talking points that we had given during the training that they attended. They had a participant guide, accompanying videos, and we separated those out into 3 levels. There were elementary materials, middle school materials, and then high school materials. So they had like a one-stop package to take back to their schools and present to their teachers to get them trained. And here we have some screenshots of those materials that we've included on the portal. And that's all we have for our slides, so we can open it up for questions for me and Kristen.
Kristen and Anissa, thank you so much for that presentation. I will allow, if anyone on the line would like to ask a question, feel free to just jump in and unmute your phone. I did have one question. I just wanted to clarify, you have all these materials, these are built around the TAP rubric, and that's the only rubric you work with, is that correct?
So we have our TAP rubric, and then the rubric that we have been working with Tennessee is a modified version of the TAP rubric.
And so you would work with on like a large scale modification, but you don't work with if a state had developed their own rubric or wanted to create one from scratch. That's not something that you work with.
Well, we're currently in the process, and I'll let Kristen talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but we are in the process of talking with other state departments and utilizing rubrics that are apart from the TAP rubric and using the resources from our portal to address those. So that is something that we are currently looking at.
And I know from your kind of best practices portal, which has been recently, I think, updated. Are those clips available for as exemplar practice for a wider audience than folks that are specifically working with you around the TAP scoring system, like the video exemplars and that type of thing?
So the user has to be a registered subscriber to have access to those clips. So if their school has access to the portal, then they have access to all of the clips at all levels, the career teachers, the administrators, any instructional leaders, but their school has to have access to the portal through a subscription through us first.
Right, and I think the other thing that we've talked to some districts about is if they're a different rubric and they're interested in, for example, our video resources, can they use those video resources and score them using their own rubric? So those kinds of conversations we're open to.
Okay, great. It does seem like you have a tremendous amount of resources, particularly around video, that might be flexible.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just had a more technical question. All of these scores, and you seem like you have a tremendous online portal for raters and observers. When they enter their scores in, and you mentioned that typically they observe, was it 6 times during the year?
It's 4 to 6 times, depending on the site. Mm-hmm.
Does your system automatically kind of collapse and aggregate the score and put an overall score, or is that something that's also customized at the district level? I guess, is there an automatic way to kind of aggregate scores across observers or multiple observations by the same observer?
There are. So depending upon whatever the scoring criteria are for that particular district or the amount of observations that they're planning on conducting, the system is set up for that number of observations, and it automatically calculates all the information for them to see what the averages are amongst observers, what the averages are amongst schools, to compare one to another, to look at only administrators or only teacher leaders as observers and compare those scores to one another. So we can set it up particular to a school district, depending on the number of observations they want to include.
Okay, great. And I think you mentioned this as well. You have a web-based training, but it sounded like in Tennessee you did both web-based and live, kind of train the trainer.
In Tennessee, all of our initial training was live.
Wow.
So they had a live trainer, and for all those 5,000 initial evaluators, they had a live training.
And you also have a web-based option.
We do. We presented a web-based option for principals to take back to their schools, but that was also going to be conducted in a live training. It was just the materials that were web-based.
And when the principals took it back to their schools, that was to really get the teachers up to speed on what the rubric looked like and how the teachers would be evaluated, right? So this was the buy-in of the stakeholders that Tim referred to earlier on.
Exactly. So they would go back to their schools, make sure their teachers understood the evaluation instrument that they were going to be observed with, and 9 times out of 10, when I conducted the training, I had principals tell me that they planned on spending much more than just a day talking about the rubric, and they planned on breaking the rubric down by indicator and having one indicator a week and tailoring some kind of professional development after school or in a faculty meeting that would really help the teachers to understand, what is this standards and objectives? What does that look like in the classroom? What are some examples of video that I can see of exemplary lessons at that level? So they were really excited about taking back that training. It really wasn't just a one day. That was just an initial requirement from the state.
Yeah, and I think that's actually great. If there aren't any other questions, I think that's a great kind of comment to end on, is that these systems that are fully aligned with the goals for the state and the district and the school and connected to professional development, and where the evaluation doesn't stand on its own, that everyone kind of buys into what these measures are and that they're important and that you have a valid way of capturing scores for teachers. It sounds like a really wonderful system, and thank you both so much for all the information you shared today.